This is the class on Torvaldsland addressing social traditions. No caste. It is a commonly held belief that the Torvaldslanders, unlike the wagon people and other similar peoples in Gore, have no caste. We don't know if that's true, for unlike the wagon people, it is never clearly stated. However, its lack of presence in Marauders of Gore and the use of salt to determine social hierarchy does support such a supposition. While we have already learned that the men of Torvaldsland are primarily free farmers, and only the best and most able might win a place on one of the great serpents, all the men of the north were expected to keep and bear weapons of good condition and in readiness should their jarl send out the war arrow. It is from this and other quotes that the assumption that all men of the north were warriors. This may perhaps be an overstatement if one considers warrior on Gore to be the equivalent of a trained scarlet caste to the south, but clearly in the north, even the free farmer was required to answer the war arrow and to do so willingly. This is warrior enough, for these giants used to such a harsh land, even the farmers do seem to make war gleefully. Another commonly held belief in Torvaldsland is a rampant dislike of caste, or those of the South, and the system of caste. And while there's no reason to necessarily change this perception, it should be noted that it was never clearly presented in the books. Additionally, we know that Southern physicians were at the Thing Fair chatting amicably with each other. That they were doing there is anyone's guess, but it doesn't give us the impression that all of Southern caste was universally disliked. No homestone. Along with caste being absent from Torvaldsland, the homestone is replaced by the hall and the Kaiserboard, giving rise to the obvious assumption that those of Torvaldsland do not have homestones. It's a difficult supposition to make, as the name for their very planet means homestone, and I quote, "Gore," he said, "is the name of this world. In the languages of this planet, the world means homestone." He paused, noting my lack of comprehension. "Homestone," he repeated. "Simply that." For better or worse, those of Essel Torvaldsland do not role-play that their villages or even their farms have homestones. Instead, the loyalty and dedication that a man of Gore gives to their city has been culturally transferred to their longhauls and villages. To a Gorean, a city is more than its buildings. It is not simply a place. Koreans believe that a city cannot simply be identified with its material elements, that it is a living thing, and perhaps more than a living thing. So too must we assume that this is the same for Torvaldslander. You can find more about homestones at www.portofironhall.com, homestone quotes. How they lived. To take a quick moment, I would like to reiterate the manner in which the people of Torvaldsland lived. Most were free farmers and lived in isolated farms along the coastline or in adjoining farms. Travel between farms is typically by small boat. We know that there were villages, but have no description of what a village in Torvaldsland looked like. Additionally, there were clear indications of great farms, holdings, and halls. Farms and holdings large enough to require keepers to manage the farms and accounts. We know that the heralds of Bluetooth could carry the war arrow to 10,000 farms. We know that the inlet of Green Cliffs was comprised of many farms. And I quote, "These legends have been spread from village to village, from remote farm to remote farm, from hall to hall." It is likely that Cassau was the last of the port cities along the coast. We know that about 1,100 people lived in Cassau proper, and another 2,300 in the outer farms. And I quote, Cassau is a town of wood, and the temple is the greatest building in the town. It towers far above the squalid huts and stabler homes of the merchants which crowd about it. 2, the town is surrounded by a wall with 2 gates, one large facing the inlet leading in from the fossa, the other small leading to the forest behind the town. The wall is of sharpened logs and is defended by a catwalk. The population of Cassau I did not think to be more than 1,100 persons. There were villages about, however, which used Cassau as their market and meeting place. If we count these, perhaps we might think of Greater Cassau as having a population in the neighborhood of 2,300 persons. What the differences are between Cassau and the holdings of Bluetooth isn't really clear. We are given the impression that the Hall of Forkbeard is the main residential building of this farm where the men and bondmaids live. We understand that a village in Torvaldsland might look at, we need to look to Norse people of the 900s to the 1200s for a best guess. As it stands with the land restrictions and Second Life, sim owners do their best to provide an appealing environment. For those who are attempting to determine what living areas in Torvaldsland would look like, we can look to the following simple descriptions. The war hour is carried to hundreds of villages and camps. Habits and customs of the northern halls and villages might be familiar to him. Him in this case is not Tarl, but him as in Forkbeard. This is misedited. On steep, isolated farms near the sea. The size of the average farm is very small. Travel between farms is often by sea and small boats. Otter, in the absence of Ivar Forkbeard, kept his cattle, his property, his farms and accounts. He was the overseer. Heralds of Bluetooth could carry the war hour, it is said, to 10,000 farms. He, Thorgard, was met by his men, and high among them his holdings keeper and the keeper of his farms. Let there be much feasting on the farms of Inlet of Green Cliffs. He, Bluetooth's captains, and the chief men from his scattered farms and holdings. The camp was made of wood, surrounded by a palisade, built on an island in an inlet called the Inlet of Thorstein's Camp, formerly known as the Inlet of Parset because of the rich fishing there. Just to give you kind of a quick snap and overview of what it felt like. Next, we're going to cover above the salt. Social status in Torvaldsland was determined by rank and position above or below the salt. In service to a jarl or a high jarl, a man might hold an officer title such as lieutenant. We do not know of other similar titles such as sergeant or the like were used. However, we know a jarl might have other officers or lawmen. Captain is a rank that seemed specifically used by one who captained a ship. Additionally, reference to chiefs, chieftains, and minor jarls existed, but as to what determined the differences are unclear. One might assume that a chief and a chieftain were the same, and the leader of a village, a camp, or cluster of farms, one who did not hold the position of jarl. A minor jarl might only be a description referring to one who wielded less power or led less than the other jarls. At one point, Bluetooth is referred to as a great jarl, supporting the supposition. You can read more about rank at www.portofironhall.com under rank quotes. Chieftains, captains, and jarls are described as high men, and it can be assumed that they held a place at the high seat or above the salt. In the long halls of the north, there stands 2 pillars at the far end of the hall facing the main doors. These pillars are often carved with luck symbols and are known as the high seat pillars or the rightful seat pillars. The high men sit at the table between these 2 pillars. The seat of honor is across from them. The hall typically then has tables running along the length of the hall, between the sides and perpendicular to the high seat. At a place approximately halfway from the door to the high seat lays a bowl of salt on each table. All that sit between the salt and the high seat are considered above the salt, and those that sit between the doors and the salt are considered below the salt. We're not told specifically who sits above the salt, but we can assume from the explanation provided that it is at least jarls, captains, chieftains, and officers. Not all halls use such distinction. For example, in the Hall of Forkbeard, all were considered equal. There's a lot of information on the Long Hall, and I'm not going to read all of it, but if you want to go and read the Long Hall quotes available on our website, you can discover the various differences between the two halls that are most deeply explained. Friendship. On the ship from Cassau to Forkbeard's holding, Tarl and Forkbeard declare each other friend, and tasted salt from the back of the wrist of the other. This is commonly called salt brother, although perhaps salt friend may be more accurate from the passage. Incidentally, the sharing of salt was a tradition in the Sahari as well that accorded great respect between new men. Such associations of the sharing of salt, in conjunction with the importance of salt in the social divisions of the North, gives the impression that this ritual accords as much weight as salt brothers did in the Tahari. We had shaken hands over the board. Friend, he had said. Friend, I had said. We had then tasted salt, each from the back of the wrist of the other, marauders of Gore. One who you shed your blood or whose hospitality you have shed becomes your sword brother. Unless you formally repudiate the blood on your weapons, it is part of the kinship of Gorean warriors, regardless of what city it is to which they owe their allegiance. While Norman doesn't repeat himself again on the topic of sword brothers in Marauders, we assume it is because it is so core to Gore as not to require yet another pedantic repetition from our beloved Norman. Hospitality. Long halls aren't taverns. They are not a place for the purchasing of food for coin. They are the home of the Jarl, even if he has private compartments. Hospitality was core to the tradition of Torvaldsland, where the host by gift and deed demonstrated his generosity towards his guests. Guests, in return, were expected to be good guests, not to shame their host or bring dishonor upon him, not to make blood fight in the hall. In return, a host would defend one he had offered hospitality to, and with great ferocity, even against his own men. As we have seen often in S.L. Torvaldsland, one who breaks hospitality with a Jarl in his hall faces violent reaction that can normally be only settled by duel or death, as it is a point of honor. Much of this passage is accepted roleplay, that is, supposition from Marauders, but it is enough for the roleplay in Torvaldsland that it should be clearly stated. I encourage each person to read more on long halls, hospitality, and honor on the website. You can read about hospitality at www.portofironhall.com. Hospitality quotes. We have a separate class on the owner of Torvaldsland. If you are at this class, you would have taken it last week. Just to touch on it again, you should really read this class. It's a fantastic class. It is entitled The Honor of Torvaldsland. While the honor of Torvaldsland is not the same as the scarlet-cased codes of the South, the men of Torvaldsland were not without honor. They were not simply outcasts and rogues with no law and no code of conduct. We propose that the honor of Torvaldsland was similar to the codes of behavior in Norse society, that honesty, hospitality, Courage, loyalty, cleverness, and luck were an integral part of Torvaldsland behavior, from the farmer to the high jarl. We invite you to listen to the class on the honor of Torvaldsland or read the transcription above. It has been converted over to YouTube at this time. Literacy. Literacy is one of the most frustrating topics to cover. There is really only one quote in the book that gives the impression that the men of Torvaldsland were illiterate. For the sake of accuracy, the quote is presented here so that we may see it in its entirety for the sake of clarity. I quote, "Can you not read these runes?" I asked Ivar again. "I'm not a rune priest," he said. Ivar's reply was not a little belligerent. I knew him able to read some rune markings. I had gathered that these, perhaps of antiquity or dialect, were beyond him. Ivar's attitude toward reading was not unlike that of many of the North. He had been taught some rune signs as a boy, that he could understand important stones, for in those stones were the names of mighty men and songs of their deeds. But it had not been expected of him that he would be in any sense a fluent reader. Ivar, like many men of the North, was actually a passable reader, but took care to conceal this fact. He belonged to the class of men who could hire their readings done for them, much as he could buy thralls to do his farming. It was not regarded as dignified for a warrior to be too expert with letters. Such a task was beneath warriors. To have a scribe's skills would tend to embarrass a man of arms and tend to lower his prestige among his peers. Many of the North then were rather proud of their illiteracy, or semi-illiteracy. It was expected of them. It honored them. His tools were not the pen and parchment, but the sword, the bow, the axe, and the spear. Besides simple runes, the men in the North was also taught tallying, counting, addition, and subtraction, so of such may be of use in farm or in the trading. He also was taught weighing. Much of his education, of course, consists of being taken into a house and taught arms, hunting, and the sea. He profits too from the sagas, which the skelds sing, journeying from hall to hall. In the fest season of Odin, a fine skull is difficult to bring to one's hall. One must bid high. Sometimes they are kidnapped, and after the season's singing given much gold and freed. I had not, of course, intended to insult the Forkbeard. "There is one sign here, of course," said the Forkbeard, "which any fool might read." He pointed to the sign. I had seen it frequently in the writings. Naturally, I could not read it. Note here it says that Forkbeard was of a class of men who could hire their reading done for him, and that it would embarrass a man of arms to have a scribe's skill. It further explains that many of the North were proud of their illiteracy or semi-illiteracy. But it is important to be clear we speak of the skill of reading, not other education. Even proud warriors of the North learned how to count, and only the wealthiest could hire other men of Torvaldsland to keep their accounts. They learned the sagas, arms, hunting, riding, poetry, and singing. In addition, they may know the meaning of some of these runes, which those of the South would not. Runes. Runes are carved on great runestones that are used both as funerary markings and boasting of great deeds. Runes are, in their simplest form, an alphabet. This is one of the 4 known alphabets in Gore. The first is the common Gurian alphabet, and the second is the Tahari script, and the third is archaic Gurian. There may be more, but I'm not familiar with them. It is commonly assumed that the runic alphabet in Torvaldsland is the Elder Futhark. I quote from Wikipedia, or tarahel.com. The name Futhark, like the word alphabet, is derived from the first few letters in the runic sequence, which differs considerably from the order of the Latin alphabet and is unique amongst alphabetic scripts. The Futhark originally consisted of 24 runes, beginning with F and ending with O, and was used by the northern Germanic tribes of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and northern Germany. The form of the runes is known as the Elder or Germanic Futhark. Copyright www.tarahill.com. It's a lot more quotes on runestones and rune priests, and we'll be going through a lot of these certainly in our rune priest class, but you can find these quotes here at www.portofironhall.com. It is also commonly assumed that the blood-soaked wooden omen chips of the rune priests, which are thrown to perform divination, are marked with runic lettering. This is a supposition and could not be discussed in great detail by those who care about such things. The important aspect to point out is that, like many early alphabets, the runes was not just an alternative lettering device, but each rune and the runes in combination were believed to have magic and religious power. Dialects. The use of typed accents in Korean roleplay is one of the most common things you will hear or receive pushback on. The quote we must ask is, did all Koreans speak the same? No, absolutely they did not. From the lisping softness of some castes in R to the melodic accents of the Tahari, examples and descriptions of different accents and even dialects existed in Gore. We know most specifically from Beasts of Gore that there are several barbarian languages spoken on Gore, usually in more remote areas. Also, some of the dialects of Korean itself were almost unintelligible. On the other hand, Korean in its variety serves as the lingua franca of civilized Gore. There are few Koreans who cannot speak it, though with some it's almost a second language. Koreans tend to be rendered more uniform through the mingling and transactions of the great fairs. One of the main reasons that Tarl chose to team up with Forkbeard is because he might know the haunts of the curry, and additionally he might know dialects of the north, some of which are quite divergent from standard Korean as it is spoken, say, in R or Koraba or even distant Turia. What that accent sounded like or what other words were used in their dialect is anyone's guess. Norman was a philosopher, not a linguist. If you're interested in languages and dialects, there is a set of quotes available here, www.portofironhall.com. I'm going to take a bit of a pause. I'm going to keep recording, but I'm going to talk about this. Men, if you do not know how to play Kaisa, you should really go learn. They teach it here at the Korean campus. It is absolutely a game that almost every Torvaldslander loved.
Don't tell them that. I want to keep winning.
Thank you, Bane. Bane would like me to inform you that you can ignore that because he would like to keep winning. With that said, I'm going to move on. Just as in the South, Kaisa is a wildly popular game. We know that the men of Torvaldsland spent many hours both on their ships and during the long winter nights playing games of Kaisa, even when the bonds must wait for attention from their jarls. The northern version of Kaisa is played quite differently than the southern version, where the jarl replaces the ubar, the jarl's woman replaces the ubara, the singer replaces the scribe, the hall replaces the homestone, the axeman replaces the tarnsman, and the rune priests replace the initiate. For many, these distinctive changes in the northern version of Kaisa has become in many ways a cultural summary of the differences between Torvaldsland and the rest of Gore. Skill in Kaisa was so important to the men of Torvaldsland that it would be used to settle disputes. Amusingly enough, the game Tug of War was also used to settle disputes. However, they would use a boss guide stretched over a long fire until someone was pulled into the fire. thought you might want to consider the fact that Tories apparently like to argue. Games of wit and physical skill were popular, not only at the Thing Fair, where displays of martial prowess earned the winner talments awarded by the High Jarl, but also during the summers and long winter nights. Wrestling in the style of early Nordic wrestling was done. The simplest form was for the wrestlers to take hold of each other's arms or waists as best they could, and using the strength of their arms to throw each other off their feet and onto their backs. A more difficult form of wrestling was that of grappling and attacking each other, sometimes fastened around by a belt at the waist, according to particular rules, and by systematic turnings and gripping movements, seeking to bring each other to the ground. Bat and ball, where the bat and ball were wielded as weapons. Only the bravest of men would play. There is a similar winter version of bat and ball that Tarl wonders if it's anything like ice hockey. Given some research into North Games, it's very likely it was. We do know that it was ancient in Torvaldsland, and Torvald himself in the sagas is said to have been skilled at it. At the Thing Fair, we know of many contests, including swimming contests, climbing the mast, jumping the crevice, walking the oar, throwing the spear, singing contests, poetry contests, rhyming games which free men competed in, not free women. Skill in poetry, riddling, and singing were as important to the well-rounded skills and knowledge of a free man of Torvaldsland. So when thinking of things to do, consider the Torvaldslander love of games, everything from dicing and riddles to tug-of-war, to kaisa, poetry, song, team sports, and so on. You can find more about the games of Torvaldsland at www.portofironhall.com, including a great game called the Cat's Cradle game, which was played by girls. All right, I am going to end this recording at the moment. This class was brought to you by Sutton's Mead, the very best of mead, directly from Odin himself, and the Korean campus. If you would like to support the Korean campus in the providing of these free classes, please send donations directly to the SIM. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again.